A jetliner approaching Dallas flies into nasty weather.
I told Debbie, they land these things all the time in the wind and rain.
By the time he had finished saying not to worry, all hell broke loose. It actually felt like it dropped like a roller coaster, straight down.
He screamed, he's gonna crash.
On this episode of When Weather Changed History, a little-known weather phenomenon slams a jumbo jet into the ground.
The first thing I thought was, my God, where's the airplane?
The front portion of the plane basically disintegrated.
It resulted in the most dramatic improvement in aviation of any accident we've ever investigated.
Friday, August 2nd, 1985. The weather is pure Dallas. Hot and muggy, with temperatures in the triple digits.
You could set your clock to Texas weather in August. In the morning, it would be bright and sunny. Temperature would start rising tremendously. We'd have typically 100-degree weather.
The day is shaping up just as National Weather Service forecaster Alan Mahler had anticipated.
We saw a weak frontal system moving into Arkansas and Oklahoma, and we had a little bit of moisture in the air, and it was very hot. We put in a slight chance of thunderstorms for the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
That afternoon, a Delta jetliner prepares for takeoff. Its journey will start in Fort Lauderdale, followed by a brief stopover in Dallas-Fort Worth. It will then continue on to Los Angeles. But flying into Dallas can be tricky. Hot, sultry weather can lead quickly to thunderstorms. It's not unusual for the skies to change in an instant, from calm to stormy and back again. 35-year-old Johnny Meyer, on the last leg of a business trip, is among 152 passengers who board Delta Flight 191. Like most large commercial airliners of the day, the plane has a designated smoking section in the rear of each cabin.
My original seat assignment when I got to the airport and checked in, they was gonna put me on a row 15 seat L, I think, which would have been in a non-smoking section of the plane.
Meyer wants a seat in the back of the plane, where smoking is allowed. The gate agent gives him a new seat right in front of a couple from Florida, Bob and Debbie Katz. The Katzes are embarking on a long-awaited getaway to the West Coast.
In '85, we were married 22 years. This was a 2-week trip that we planned, and I guess it was the first time since our honeymoon that we were going to really be away that long.
A last-minute change in their flight plan bumps the couple from first class down to coach.
I was worried about my golf clubs getting lost, actually, and then having, not the first-class accommodations that we thought we were going to have.
Since Bob wants to sit in a smoking section, they're relegated to the very back of the plane. As the Katzes board, Debbie lets her husband know she's annoyed by the turn of events.
We started walking down what seemed to be a very, very long airplane, and she was a little angry at me because she said, if it wasn't for your smoking, we wouldn't have to be sitting all the way in the back of the airplane.
After takeoff, the Katzes strike up a conversation with Johnny Meyer. They also do a little videotaping.
In 1985, they just came out with the portable, VHS recorders, and I had one on the plane with me.
He was filming a camcorder outside the plane, and he was saying that this was their first vacation in a long time.
Next stop, Dallas-Fort Worth. See you later.
The The aircraft is a Lockheed L-1011, a wide-body workhorse with an excellent safety record. In command is Captain Edward Connors, an experienced pilot with 29,000 flight hours to his credit.
Early in his career, he had been on a flight that had been hijacked to Cuba. His wife happened to be a stewardess flying on the same flight and had a knife held to her throat by one of the hijackers. And in spite of all that, he was unflappable.
Among the crew is First Officer Rudolph Price. Several years earlier, he had worked with Delta Airlines to rewrite the pilot operating manual for their L-1011 fleet. The cabin has 2 aisles and a passenger capacity of 302. Today's flight carries only about half that number, plus 11 crew members. As the plane approaches the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, the weather is still calm. Around 5:30 p.m., air traffic controller Michael Porter leaves his post for a quick dinner break. About a half hour later, a National Weather Service radar specialist 100 miles west of Dallas sees what looks like thunderstorm activity near the airport. He calls the Fort Worth forecast office. A meteorologist there takes the report under advisement. But because there is no hail, high winds, or heavy rains associated with the storm, he decides not to issue a weather warning to the DFW airport. 10 miles southeast of DFW, in the town of Irving, firefighter Micah Calfee pauses outside his firehouse and gazes upward.
I looked to the northwest and I saw black, ominous clouds and thought, oh my goodness, yeah, it's gonna be bad. And we've got a open cab fire engine, and so we're probably gonna get wet.
6:03 p.m. Delta 191 is cleared to land. On board, Captain Connors tells his passengers, quote, "We enjoyed having you. By the way, it's 100 degrees in Dallas."
Debbie looked out the window and looked in front of the plane and saw very, very black sky, and she got a little nervous.
I told Debbie, they land these things all the time in the wind and rain, so it won't be no problem about landing this thing.
So I kind of got calm, and that's the last thing I remember.
By the time he had finished saying not to worry, all hell broke loose.
It got so dark that you couldn't see out the window. It was just like somebody cut the lights off at 6 o'clock at night. The wind picked up real bad. You could hear the rain and see the rain hitting the windows. The plane was really rocking back and forth. I turned around and told Bob and Debbie, I said, you better tighten your seatbelts because it's going to be a rough ride.
As Delta 191 prepares to land, air traffic controller Michael Porter returns from his break. The view outside his window is now very different than it was a half hour earlier.
And that's what I thought when I swung open the door was, uh-oh.
Air traffic control has assigned Delta 191 to land on runway 17L. But as it descends through the clouds, passengers see the ground coming toward them much too quickly.
It felt like we was getting pushed, like somebody was on top of us, pushing us down.
That's next on When Weather Changed History.
It actually felt like it dropped like a roller coaster, straight down.
August 2nd, 1985. In Dallas, Texas, a late afternoon storm suddenly turns ferocious. A Delta jetliner trying to land careens through the dark sky, terrifying its passengers.
If we weren't strapped in our seatbelts, we probably would have been flying all over the cabin. At the same time, the service trays were rolling up and down the aisles. The overhead bins opened up, stuff was coming out.
In the cockpit, the crew fights to regain control of the L-1011 as it approaches the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Then, for a moment, it feels as if the danger has passed.
It actually seemed like the plane, got itself corrected and it was going to be all right.
6:05 p.m. Delta 191 is about a mile from its intended runway when it slams into a grassy field. It then bounces back up, flying low toward Highway 114.
It all happened very fast, but when we hit the ground, I thought we were okay. I turned to Debbie and I just told her, hold on, we're okay, just a rough landing. But I didn't realize we were not on the runway of the airport.
Air traffic controller Michael Porter is one of two people manning the control tower. His partner is waiting for Delta Flight 191 to emerge from the black storm. Unaware that the plane has already bounced off the ground and is out of control. But when Delta 191 does come into view, it's clear that something is very wrong. The plane's nose is too low, and its left wing is angled down. The air traffic controller calls for the crew to abort its landing.
I actually heard the controller working Delta 191. I heard him say, Delta, go around. But even so, that didn't cause me too much alarm because we send aircraft around, not a lot, but that's our job when somebody doesn't clear the runway. But just seconds later, he screamed, he's going to crash.
Delta 191 hits the ground again.
The plane landed more or less intact, rolled across the state highway. When it was rolling across the highway, the left engine plowed into a small car, which immediately killed the driver.
A fire erupts near the middle of the cabin, first on the left side and then on the right.
The fire was just coming closer and closer to us, from the front of the plane to the back of the plane. Everybody in front of us was just burned alive, with the exception of a couple of rows.
But just a bolt of fire came back down the left side of the plane. And I was still sitting up, looking ahead, couldn't believe what was happening until the second fire came back on our side of the plane, and that's when I ducked my head.
The flames were getting closer and closer to us. And last thing I said to Debbie was duck, and we put our heads down.
Just before the flames reach the rear section, Delta 191 smashes into two giant water tanks.
When Delta 191 hit the water tanks, the front portion of the plane basically disintegrated.
The plane just split in half, and the part of the plane that was on fire went in one direction, and the section that we were in went tumbling in another direction.
It broke apart 2 rows in front of where I was sitting. I looked up and there was nothing in front of me but just the sky and the remains of the airplane.
When it stopped, I was hanging from my seatbelt and Debbie was gone.
For a moment, the sky is clear outside the air traffic control tower. Michael Porter expects to see a down jumbo jet. He's horrified to discover only a collection of metal scraps and burning rubber tires.
The first thing I thought was, my God, where's the airplane? And I was stunned because I know how big the L-1011 is. The airplane was totally gone.
"10 miles away, an emergency call comes into fire station number 6 in Irving, Texas.
Engine 4, truck 7, structure fire.
EMS firefighter Micah Calfee receives sketchy details about a, quote, possible structure fire on Highway 114, just north of the airport. He and his crew hurry into an older open cab fire engine. As they head out, the weather is clear.
It wasn't raining or anything like that where we were, and we drove north, and we drove into incredible weather. We turned on 114. The wind was unbelievable. You had to pretty much hold on to the fire engine or you'd be blown down.
On Highway 114, the EMS crew discovers the crushed wreckage of a car.
Everyone was still trying to determine exactly what has happened here. All right, we've got a major accident. Well, where's the truck that hit this car?
Calfee then sees what appears to be part of a small plane.
And I was thinking the whole time, this is a freight aircraft. We're not going to have large numbers of people. And I came up on the first person laying there on the ground. And this person was laying in the water, not a mark on them. And yet they were obviously very, very dead. I walked a little bit further, we started seeing more people, more and more people, more and more people. And as I got closer to the aircraft, I came to realize this is just the tail section of a large passenger aircraft.
There was a huge debris field. The only thing that really you could recognize as part of an aircraft was the tail section. That became really the iconic image of Delta 191.
While some of the passengers in the tail section are dead or severely injured, others are able to make their way out of their seats and onto the ground, some 20 feet below.
I used the seat backs to climb down to the ground.
I had to undo my seatbelt, hang on to the seat next to me, and kind of just jump to the ground. But at the same time, you had to watch where you was falling to, because there was 3 passengers down there where you was going to land that were dead.
Coming up, the horrifying aftermath of the crash and the frantic search for survivors.
I can see the other part of the airplane still on fire. I didn't see Debbie anyplace.
That's next on When Weather Changed History. August 2nd, 1985. While trying to land during a vicious storm over Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Delta Flight 191 has crashed and disintegrated into countless pieces. The L-1011 carried 152 passengers and 11 crew members. 134 people on board die at the crash site, along with the driver of a car on a nearby highway. Only 29 on board are still alive. Most of the survivors were seated in the rear smoking section, which split away when the plane hit a pair of water tanks. The rest of the plane is barely recognizable.
It looked like an atom bomb went off. It was just total chaos.
Johnny Meyer had been sitting one row in front of Debbie and Bob Katz. Debbie was thrown from her seat and is nowhere in sight. Now, Bob searches frantically for his wife in the muddy debris.
It was horrible down there. There was bodies and body parts, people, a couple of people screaming, walking around like they were lost.
Something familiar catches his eye. It's the case for his video camera. Next to it is a photograph of his children.
As soon as I bent down to pick it up, there was another photograph, and I picked that one up, and then there was another photograph.
He follows the trail of family photos to where Debbie lies, motionless, near the tail section of the plane.
I wasn't sure at first if she was dead or alive because I couldn't detect any breathing. And I was just sitting there, kind of in a stupor, and then realized that, she had moved the corner of her mouth.
Just after the crash, the skies had cleared, but now the weather takes another nasty turn.
It got dark, it started to rain, it started to hail. The wind was so strong that I was on all fours trying to shelter Debbie from the elements, and the wind was so strong that it actually knocked me off my feet.
Johnny Meyer joins Bob at Debbie's side.
I picked up some insulation from the plane and held it over our heads. The hail was about quarter size, and we was getting pelted.
EMS firefighter Micah Calfee is manning a triage area. Bob calls him over to where Debbie is lying on the ground.
Her blood pressure was horribly low, and so I wanted to get a couple of IVs into her real quick.
Debbie is rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She's suffered extensive damage to her spinal cord and has life-threatening internal injuries. Miraculously, Debbie Katz survives the crash, but remains in a coma for several days.
I don't remember the rescue at all. The first thing I remember is opening my eyes in an intensive care unit and seeing Bob. I couldn't speak, but I didn't know why I couldn't speak. And he told me we were in a terrible accident and a lot of people died, but we didn't.
In the weeks ahead, 2 more people die from their injuries, while families mourn their loss and survivors start the long road to recovery. Investigators begin to search for answers. They need to know, why did Delta Flight 191 crash? And could a mysterious force of nature be to blame? That's next on When Weather Changed History. August 1985. In the days after the crash of Delta Flight 191, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board begin sifting through the wreckage at the accident site. The L-1011 jetliner crashed while trying to land during a sudden and violent storm.
There was a huge debris field. The only thing that really you could recognize as part of an aircraft was the tail section.
Reporter Ed Timms interviews survivors for the Dallas Morning News.
One of the things that I remember passengers commenting on was how little time they actually had to process the fact that something was wrong. Literally everything fell apart in less than 2 minutes. And so they go from thinking nothing's wrong at all to hanging from their seat belts in midair.
An important early step in the crash investigation is studying data from the plane's cockpit voice and flight data recorders. That data, along with other facts uncovered by investigators, reveal how a complex chain of events led to disaster. After Delta 191 leaves Fort Lauderdale, the flight is smooth and uneventful, except for a slight reroute to avoid a storm over New Orleans. 5:51 p.m. As Delta Flight 191 nears DFW, the first officer says it appears to be raining over Fort Worth. A National Weather Service observer at the airport sends an electronic message to the control tower, reporting on a storm cell and volatile winds. But air traffic control fails to relay the entire message to planes approaching DFW. 5:56 p.m. An air traffic controller radios a message to planes in the area, stating that there's a little rain shower just north of the airport. First Officer Rudolph Price responds with a joke saying, quote, "We're gonna get our airplane washed." 6 p.m. Air traffic control asks Delta 191 to reduce its speed to allow a larger interval between it and a Learjet that's about to land just ahead on runway 17L.
Delta 191 Heavy, reduce your speed to 160, please. Be glad to.
Meanwhile, a weather radar specialist in Stephenville, Texas, sees what looks like thunderstorm activity near the airport. He phones his report to a Fort Worth weather office, but the forecaster there doesn't think the threat is severe enough to warrant issuing a special warning to DFW. 6:03 p.m., Delta 191 is cleared to land. An air traffic controller comments on what he sees outside his window.
And we're getting some variable winds out there due to a shower on their short funnel out there north end of DFW.
An unidentified flight crew member says, quote, stuff moving in. Captain Edward Connors doesn't seem concerned.
I hear the rain feels good.
An automated weather transmission to the cockpit reports 5-knot winds with 15-knot gusts, well within a safe range for landing. 6:04 p.m. First Officer Price notices lightning in the clouds ahead.
Lightning coming out of that one. What? Lightning coming out of that one. Right ahead.
An American Airlines jet, landing a few minutes ahead of Delta 191, hits a wall of shifting wind during its final approach. However, the crew of that plane does not report this to the tower. 6:05 p.m. As Delta 191 prepares to land, the plane's airspeed suddenly increases by 20 knots. Captain Connors tells First Officer Price to watch his speed. Then, just seconds later, while the plane is only about 1,000 feet from the ground, its airspeed suddenly drops. An automated voice alarm tells the crew they're too close to the ground.
Pull up. Push it up. Push it way up.
First Officer Price opens the throttle. The cockpit voice recorder picks up the sound of a violent impact. Delta 191 hits the ground about a mile short of runway 17L. It bounces up from a grassy field, and for a moment, it's again airborne. An air traffic controller tells the crew to abort its landing,
Delta, go around.
not realizing that the plane is already out of control. It slams down again, this time demolishing a car on Highway 114, killing the driver. The left wing then clips the ground, spinning the L-1011 toward a pair of giant storage tanks, each holding 2 million gallons of water. The plane, already on fire, breaks apart as it rips into the water tanks.
Nobody is to land at the airport. We've had a crash.
Investigators immediately suspect that weather had a hand in the crash of Delta 191. The most obvious clue is the violent storm that moved over the airport just as the plane was landing. The next clues are found in the flight data recorder. It reveals that the plane's airspeed suddenly increased, then decreased while landing. It's the classic 1-2 punch of a little-known weather phenomenon called microburst. In the years before the crash, meteorologist Alan Muller studied the microburst phenomenon, which is the most violent kind of wind shear.
Wind shear is when we have winds moving in different directions. The tornado has wind shear. A windstorm on a large scale in a thunderstorm has wind shear. The type of thing we're talking about with a microburst is a very small area of very strong wind shear. Air is moving in different directions.
Microbursts are especially dangerous for planes trying to land. That's when pilots have the least amount of room to maneuver.
As a microburst falls, the aircraft at first will have a headwind, and that will give him more indicated airspeed, and he'll rise higher. He doesn't want to do that. He's on final approach. And so he wants to bring it down, and that's what he does, and he gets to the other side of the microburst where he loses lift, and he simply falls to the ground.
The night before the crash, Muller's office issued a forecast calling for a slight chance of isolated afternoon showers. The afternoon of August 2nd, Muller stepped outside his home and saw clouds in the skies to the northeast. The weather, he believed, created the perfect conditions for a microburst.
From time to time, we do get some thunderstorms because it's hot and we get a little bit of Gulf moisture coming up. And those storms often will give us problems with winds. Usually not much hail, usually not much in the way of flash flooding, but very strong winds. And the strongest of those winds, of course, will be microburst.
Mueller's suspicions are confirmed when investigators determine that a microburst did play a part in the crash of Delta Flight 191.
We not only learned that the L-1011 encountered a microburst, but we learned the severity of that microburst and turbulence through which this plane was trying to fly.
Mother Nature isn't the only suspect in this tragedy. The entire system responsible for air safety is scrutinized, including the National Weather Service, the FAA, the pilots, and even Delta Airlines. In the months ahead, investigators discover that Delta 191 was the victim of bad weather and bad decisions.
All of that created, the perfect storm, so to speak, that led to this accident.
That's next on When Weather Changed History. October 1985. Long before investigators released their final report on the crash of Delta 191, they know that the plane had been in the grip of a severe form of wind shear known as microburst during its final approach to the runway. The NTSB's findings came as no surprise to a renowned professor of meteorology at the University of Chicago named Tetsuya Fujita. Dr. Fujita coined the term microburst a decade earlier, after a devastating Midwestern tornado left a starburst-like pattern in a field of downed trees. He warned that microbursts were particularly dangerous to airplanes, especially during takeoff and landing. A string of accidents and near misses seemed to back up Fujita's claims. 1974, Samoa. A crash kills 97 people. A year later, at New York's JFK Airport, another crash kills 113. Both disasters are blamed on microbursts. 1982, Louisiana. A Pan Am Boeing 727 taking off from New Orleans Airport crashes in the nearby town of Kenner, killing all 145 people on board and 8 on the ground. That plane also encountered a microburst. At the time of the Kenner crash, New Orleans International did have a wind shear alert system similar to those at other airports. It consists of sensors mounted on poles. The system is not perfect. Winds circulating above the top of the poles go undetected, and if the poles are spaced too far apart, a very small weather system can hide between them.
The system then was full of holes. It wasn't really adequate to give a comprehensive alert of wind shear at the airport.
After the Kenner crash, the NTSB recommends improving the existing wind shear detection systems and implementing a brand new technology called Doppler radar. Conventional radar uses reflected radio waves to determine where an object is.
A regular radar is throwing out a beam of energy, and that energy is intercepting thunderstorms or rain clouds, and some of that energy is coming back to the radar, and you see a radar echo.
Doppler radar reveals not only an object's location, but also its speed and the direction in which it's moving.
Doppler radar is going beyond that, in that you could see the storms, but you also see that things are moving in directions something like this, towards the radar and away from the radar, or vice versa.
Doppler had shown great promise in detecting wind speed and fluctuations sooner and more accurately at airports, an environment where every second counts. But airports were hesitant to adopt the new system. Doppler was expensive, and there were concerns that newer, better technology might be right around the corner, making Doppler obsolete. On the day of the Delta crash, DFW also had a wind shear alert system. But that system didn't sound an alarm until 12 minutes after the plane slammed into the ground, killing more than 130 people.
In those days, the sensors weren't located except right on the airport and on the boundary. So we weren't picking up any wind shear on the boundary because the storm wasn't there.
As investigators dig deeper, they discover other, more troubling issues. They realize that the entire system responsible for getting weather information to pilots is slow, inefficient, and potentially unreliable.
It really became apparent that getting weather information to the cockpit is absolutely critical, but it didn't seem to be a real orderly process.
There were several instances during Delta 191's final hour in which weather information was either incomplete or relayed too late to save the plane and its passengers. But the most controversial weather-related decision would turn out to be the crew's choice to fly right into the thunderstorm, which they had clearly seen before landing. Cockpit crews have a bird's-eye view of the weather immediately in front of them, even more so than the air traffic controllers on the ground. And no matter what kind of weather reports the crew does or does not receive, the plane's captain has the final authority to either land as scheduled or choose another option.
It's not my decision to even say, I recommend you don't go through there. That's up to them.
So even though some of the reports from the ground never reached the crew of Delta 191, they were very much aware of an immediate danger.
The information that could have been provided was basically available to the crew through their own observation.
The cockpit voice recorder shows the crew had seen bad weather ahead as they approached DFW.
Lightning coming out of that one. What? Lightning coming out of that one. Right ahead.
Despite seeing the bad weather, the crew decided not to abort the landing.
The crew chose to fly into that cloud.
August 1986. 1 year after the crash, the NTSB releases its official report. It lays blame for the crash of Delta 191 on a variety of factors, including the crew's decision to land during a thunderstorm, lack of guidelines and training on how to avoid and escape wind shear, and the lack of accurate wind shear hazard information. Delta vehemently defends its pilots. The airline files a lawsuit blaming air traffic controllers and the National Weather Service for failing to provide timely information to the crew. But in the end, a federal judge rules that although there were failures in communication, the crew was ultimately to blame. Air traffic controller Michael Porter wonders about what might have been and what's happened since.
Like a lot of accidents, you think, oh boy, if just this hadn't happened or this part hadn't happened, then it would have been avoided altogether. And yet, if we'd avoided the crash, would we have all the changes we had today?
It resulted in the most dramatic improvement in aviation of any aviation accident we've ever investigated.
That's next, in the conclusion of When Weather Changed History. The aftermath of Delta Flight 191 shines a harsh light on the issue of aviation safety. After the crash, the NTSB called for improvements in wind shear detection systems, including the installation of Doppler radar. Over the next 2 decades, this new technology would be installed in 45 U.S. airports.
We can get the information to the pilot from 2 to 6 minutes ahead of the microburst. That is an amazing amount of time given what we had 20 years ago, which is almost nothing.
Another legacy of Delta 191 is better pilot training. Today, commercial pilots are trained in how to avoid microbursts and how to navigate through the ones they can't.
Airspeed stagnated. Wind shear. Wind shear.
Pilots learn to increase power and lift the plane's nose to help break free of a microburst grip.
Speed's increasing. You're climbing 1,000. Speed's good. Speed 145, level. Climbing 2,000. Speed's good. You're out of it.
More than 2 decades have passed since the crash of Delta Flight 191. Survivor Johnny Myers still works for the same Texas company he did back in 1985. The people of Flight 191 have not faded from his memory.
Everybody that survived the plane crash that sees this or hears this, I hope their life has been enjoyable, just like mine has been. For the ones that didn't make it, I still remember them in my prayers.
After a long rehabilitation, fellow survivor Debbie Katz went on to defy her doctor's predictions that she would never breathe on her own or walk again.
My gait is off. I've fallen many times. I don't like to use a cane, so I'll hold on to someone. But I try not to think about it.
After Debbie's recovery, the Katzes opened a muffin shop near their Fort Lauderdale home.
I live my life one day at a time. I don't make any long-range plans, and I'm happy to be alive.
The Katzes harbor no bitterness toward the crew and pilot of Delta 191.
I read a lot of stories in the newspaper later on over the years about it being the pilot's final decision, but I also learned about wind shear. And wind shear was what caused the plane to go down. So I don't have any anger.
Everybody makes mistakes. He just made a bad decision.